Hello A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here with another video. We want to thank the Beatles for Revolution to get us kind of in the mood for our next chapter 7a, The Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. And this video is a little bit unusual because most of the videos I made were during the 2014-2015 school year. However, this video got muted for whatever reason, probably some music problem again. And so I'm making it in 2016. And the crazy thing about tonight, it's the first debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So it's going on tonight, 9 o'clock. I'm excited to see how that plays out. But anyway, let's get into some history. All right, let's look at our quote here. John Adams, future president, also one of the founding fathers. In 1818, 40 years after the Revolution, he says, "The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people." So basically, he is saying that the revolution happened 10, 15 years before the actual fighting at Lexington and Concord, that the Americans were ready for a revolution as early as the 1760s. All right, the first section of reading is called The Deep Roots of Revolution. Kind of goes with the John Adams quote on the previous slide. The revolution, like I said, is not the same as the American War for Independence, or also known as the Revolutionary War. So the revolution is different from the Revolutionary War. The revolution, according to our textbook author Kennedy, was over 150 years. It begins really with Jamestown, and America is starting to feel different. And slowly, over 150 years, the revolution starts to eventually take place by the 1770s. One of the biggest reasons for the revolution, that distance weakens authority. Britain was over 3,000 miles away from the colonies, and so the colonists had freedom, and we know that term salutary neglect. The British let the colonists, for the most part, do what they want, and so that gave the colonists more power, more freedom, and eventually start to make them feel like they were not British anymore. And this kind of goes to the last quote down here, last couple. American colonists gradually feel different than Britain. They start to feel more American. And they didn't think of themselves as transplanted Britons. So again, they didn't think of themselves as British. By the 1760s and 1770s, they saw themselves as Americans and definitely different than the British. All right, our next section of the book is Mercantile Theory, and our author of the textbook, David Kennedy, he talks a lot about mercantilism. The next few sections are about this mercantilism theory, and it's very important in A-Push. Perhaps the author goes on too much, but it is important. If you ever see a question dealing with economics before the revolution, chances are they're looking for mercantilism ideas in your responses. So mercantilism is very important. All right, some background, some context of mercantilism. We know that in the 1600s, most of the English colonies were done haphazardly. There was no uniform set way of how to start the colonies. Some were for religious reasons, some were joint stock companies, trading companies, others were land speculators. Some, like Georgia, was a buffer zone. So there's no real uniform manner of how the colonies were created. However, by the 1700s especially, this idea of mercantilism becomes very important to England. And so here's the definition of mercantilism. It's a theory, an economic theory, that all parts of an economy should be coordinated for the good of the mother country. So I would definitely highlight, circle, star, mercantilism, and definitely highlight the good of the mother country. And in this case, it is England. So all the colonies in America, their ultimate purpose, according to England, was to serve England. And these are three ways that the colonists were supposed to serve the mother country of England. First, the colonies were supposed to provide a market for England's manufactured goods. And by the 1700s, manufacturing was still not really gaining a whole lot of traction, but England was starting to manufacture some things. And if they are making things like shoes or whatnot in England, they need a place to sell them, and America was a place to buy English goods. Second, just as important, the colonies would provide raw materials for England. Okay, we know that tobacco was very important in the Chesapeake, and the Chesapeake region was supposed to provide tobacco and other raw materials for England. The grain colonies, potentially wheat, and some of the southern colonies like South Carolina, potentially rice for England. So, besides a market for England manufactured goods, the colonies were supposed to provide raw materials for England. And finally, the colonies were supposed to provide England with ships, ship stores, and sailors. A lot of alliteration there. And this especially was going to be found in New England area. Okay, so in the New England area, a lot of timber, perhaps down in New York as well, maybe in the middle counties, provide England with these valuable resources as well to help the mother country become a more powerful empire. And another key thing, which we'll keep in the back of our mind, trade was forbidden with other countries, especially England's biggest enemy, France. All right, more mercantilism. Mercantilist, Trammels, trade. So in order for this mercantilism policy to work, which means supporting the mother country, a strong central government was needed to enforce the rules. And in this case, we're talking about England or Britain, which I use the term England and Britain kind of interchangeably, especially during the colonial period. They basically mean the same place. All right, so England needed to start to have a more stronger central government to enforce the rules. All right, so we know that the colonists were supposed to help Britain maintain naval supremacy by giving them ships, naval stores, sailors, and trade. We talked about this on the previous slide, that the colonists were supposed to help Britain become a naval power by giving them these resources. And this has been mentioned before in A Push, but Parliament does pass measures to enforce this mercantilism system. These are called the Navigation Acts. Highlight these. And if you notice, there are several throughout the 1600s that are passed and then into 1733. Now, we know that these navigation acts were not enforced much at all because of salutary neglect, but I did highlight 1733 because that was also the same year as another law that was passed, very similar to the navigation acts, kind of restricting the colonist trade, and that was what act was that? 1733 Molasses. The Molasses Act was an example of a navigation act passed by Britain. Also, Parliament passed laws to restrict trade to and from the colonies as well. So they're starting to slowly end their policy of salutary neglect, especially as we get into the mid-1700s. All right, and finally, the American colonists were even restricted in what they could produce, such as woolen cloth and beaver hats. They had to complete, not compete against England. So the colonists, in a lot of cases, were forbidden to produce things that England also produced. So these two goods here, woolen cloth and beaver hats, were produced in the factories in England, and the colonists were prevented or restricted from trying to create that because that would cause competition against England. A couple of things, there was no banks in the colonies, so most of economic trade was done through the barter system, and currency eventually starts to get created as we get towards the Revolution, but there are problems as well. So again, very limited banking system in the colonial period. All right, there it is. Salutary neglect, highlight that. Oh my goodness, the must. And we've already hit this quite a bit in this class. We talked about it, but it's basically the time period when Britain left the colonies alone so they could develop their own political, economic, and social systems. Again, there's always this gray area. Beamer, when does salutary neglect happen? Well, I mean, you could argue it began even with Jamestown and continued to 1754. But a general time period would be the late 1600s to 1754, and I think this year is the most important year. 1754 because it becomes such an important year because that is the beginning of the French and Indian War, which we talked about last chapter in chapter 6. So from the late 1600s to the French and Indian War, for the most part, England has salutary neglect, a hands-off policy, allowed the colonies to grow on their own. Eventually, after the French and Indian War, especially after 1754, England starts to put their hands on the colonists, try to control the colonists more, and the colonists would turn to smuggling their goods on the high seas. So this next part is trying to show how America actually benefited from mercantilism. Okay, and so what the author Kennedy is saying is that ship builders and ship suppliers did get paid pretty well, especially in New England. We know that tobacco planters, especially I would highlight them, they had a guaranteed monopoly with Britain. We know that when we see tobacco, we think of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. This region was hesitant to join the Revolution, partly because their economy was so dependent on England and they had a pretty nice monopoly with Britain or England. Also, there's political benefits as well during the mercantilism system. Self-government was allowed by the colonial legislatures, and there was no taxes for the military imposed by Britain. So although British forces were in America, they were there to mostly protect against Native Americans, the colonists did not have to pay any taxes for the military benefit. You've probably seen this before. The American was probably better off than the average English person back in Europe, even though most colonists did not like the mercantilism system because it kind of told them what to do. They still probably had it better than people in Europe. And some people argue that France and Spain was actually tougher on their colonies in the Western Hemisphere than England. Again, that's a little bit debatable. But in the end, to summarize, although there was some benefits for the colonists, overall they did not like the mercantilism system. All right, now let's go to the problems of mercantilism in more detail. The menace of mercantilism. Okay, I don't know if you know so much or not, but our author does a lot of alliteration. Anyway, after 1763, so this is such an important year. It's after the French and Indian War. The Proclamation of 1763 was created. The British government began to enforce its mercantilist policies. Okay, this is very important. After the war, French and Indian War, they're enforcing the mercantilism policies, enforcing the navigation laws, and this is making Americans mad. And eventually, this is going to lead to the American Revolution. I mentioned this on the previous slide. Southerners on the Chesapeake region were treated better than in New England, mostly because of the crops they produced. England really needed. New England, actually, in a lot of ways, was going to be competing against England for shipbuilding and also eventually for manufactured goods. So the region that does not like England is going to be New England. It's kind of unusual to think about. All right, with that said, the Southerners did have a few gripes as well with the British. They could only sell to Britain, so they were not allowed, or they were forbidden to sell to other countries because of navigation laws. In a lot of ways, the British merchants, the people who bought the southern crops, were unfair to them, and the Virginians really couldn't do a ton about it. And sometimes the Virginians did go deep into debt with falling tobacco prices because they were at the mercy of the British economy. So, although the South was treated better than New England by the British, there were some problems as well. And in the end, Americans felt they were being used by the British, and they felt, and this is an interesting way to think about it, the colonies, the American colonies, felt they were kept in a state of perpetual economic adolescence and never allowed to come of age. And so basically, they felt they were being treated like teenagers. They're never allowed to grow up by their parents, who in this case is the British. And eventually, we know that sometimes teenagers will start to rebel against their parents, and we see this in the 1760s in America. All right, most of the next part of the video is about the Stamp Act. Okay, the Stamp Act is a must-know and A-push, absolutely, so we got a lot of stuff to cover. All right, so let me give you the background of this. So, we know that Britain is going deep in debt because of the French and Indian Wars. They need new revenues. They need to find new ways to pay for their debts. And so they decide first to garrison 10,000 redcoats. Redcoats are the British Army. They leave 10,000 British in America for the colonists' own protection. They left them there to protect them against Native Americans. Also, the Prime Minister of Britain, George Grenville, right here, ordered the British Navy to strictly enforce the navigation laws. So now we got 10,000 soldiers in America. The navigation laws are now going to be enforced after 1763. First minor law passed against the Americans was the Sugar Act of 1764. Pretty minor, but it was one of the first tax for revenue purposes against the Americans. They didn't like it. Also, another law, maybe I would highlight this one, the Quartering Act in 1765. This law said that the colonists had to provide food and housing for British soldiers. The colonists are unhappy with that, but it's going to get worse in 1765. Much worse with the Stamp Act. Okay, and before we get to the next slide, here are some key questions with actually the answers over the next section. So a couple key things. What famous saying comes out of the angry colonial throats during the Stamp Act? The rebellion of the Stamp Act is no taxation without representation. This is one of the most famous sayings in A-push, and it says you cannot tax us without representation in Congress, or in this case in Parliament. Okay, so the second thing, what group could legislate the colonists and could tax the colonists? Okay, so Parliament, again, Parliament is the British government. Okay, they're like the Congress of today. They pass the laws. And so Parliament in Britain legislated and passed the laws against the colonists, and the American colonial legislatures could actually tax them as well, is what they felt. However, Parliament starts to tax the colonists, and this made the colonists mad because they felt the only people that could tax them were the American colonial governments, not Parliament. So this is what's kind of with a root problem with the Stamp Act. Another huge term to highlight is virtual representation. The colonists were virtually represented in Parliament because all members of Parliament represent all British subjects. So, I would know this, maybe write this down, the British liked this idea. They felt this idea was true. The British felt the colonists were virtually represented. Okay, so they didn't need an actual colonist in Parliament because Parliament represented all British subjects. The Americans hated virtual representation. They were against it, and they wanted actual representation. The Americans wanted a person from America, like Ben Franklin, in Parliament to represent them. And that's kind of at the root of no taxation without representation. All right, we hit some of these things in the previous slide, but again, this is the highlight. This is the mother of all acts, the Stamp Act. You need to know the year 1765 as well. And this is really where it begins. The revolution really begins in earnest here with this act. And again, the point of the Stamp Act is to pay for British soldiers in America by providing protection for the Americans against Native Americans. And the British wanted the colonists to pay 33% of the cost of the soldiers. So the colonists were not supposed to pay for all of it, just a third of it, but yet they're still unhappy because of no taxation without representation. All right, so down here is kind of what the Stamp Act was about. So it was a tax on all commercial and legal documents, playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, etc. And so most documents that were created had to have this stamp on it, a British stamp. So if you wanted to create one of these or buy one of these things, you had to pay this tax called the Stamp Act. And Americans were mad. A lot of Americans were mad with the Stamp Act because they asked themselves this question: why is a British army needed when the French were gone? The French were expelled after the French-Indian War. Why do we need British soldiers? So that's part of the reason why they were upset with the Stamp Act. Again, no taxation without representation. It becomes a huge deal. And lastly, we did mention these two things on the previous slide. Virtual representation is the British belief. The British government felt the colonists were virtually represented in Parliament, but we know that the colonists wanted actual. So the Americans were all about actual representation. They wanted a real-life person in Parliament. Okay, so I have this term really down here, and so what I have by this, what I mean by this is that if the Americans, the colonists, actually had a couple people in Parliament, would that really do them any good? Okay, because I think the British would still tax them with the Stamp Act, and they really couldn't do much about it. Would the Americans have accepted the Stamp Act if they had people in Parliament? We'll never know. And because there is no actual representation, this gives the colonists the excuse to start to rebel. And boy, can Americans rebel. In one way, the colonists rebel against the Stamp Act is by creating the Stamp Act Congress. We'll get to this in the next slide in more detail. Again, here are some key questions that I actually answer for you that I think are very important. 1765 was the Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies sent representatives to talk about their grievances to repeal the Stamp Act. Okay, so 9 of the 13 colonies. If you remember the Albany Plan in 1754, that had 7 of the 13 colonies. So we're seeing a few more colonies join the Stamp Act Congress. Huge term, non-importation agreements. Basically, it's a type of boycott. Okay, non-importation agreements. I'd highlight this term. The colonies agreed to not buy any British goods, and so it's a type of boycott that was used to show how much upset they were with the Stamp Act. And then number 3, how did the colonists become violent in response to the Stamp Act? Well, the Sons of Liberty. Okay, this is a group of patriots, I guess you'd call them. They're people who definitely started to get mad against the British. They decided to tar and feather the colonists who did not comply with non-importation. So if they saw colonists buying British goods, they could be tarred and feathered, and that's not a pleasant idea. Hot tar thrown on the body, and then they put a bunch of feathers on you, and embarrassing, it's a humiliating and painful experience. So they tried to use violence to try to get the colonists to be supportive of non-importation agreements. Also, they would ransack British officials' homes in Boston especially. They would hang in effigy some stamp agents. Okay. All right, this is quite difficult for me to describe, so I'll just put up a visual of what hanging in effigy looks like, and basically it was meant to ridicule, to criticize the stamp agents, and to warn them not to mess with the colonists. All right, and finally, what happens, number 4, to the Stamp Act in 1766? It is repealed. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, and in its place, Parliament of Britain creates the Declaratory Act saying, we will repeal the Stamp Act, but we can pass any laws if we want to in the future against the colonists. Okay, so they're trying to save face with the failure of the Stamp Act. So in the end, the Stamp Act was repealed. The Stamp Act Congress was successful. Non-importation worked, and it showed the colonists that, hey, we can win, we can get things done against the British if we boycott and stand together. Okay, this is just a review of the last two slides. Then, so the Stamp Act Congress, a must know. They meet in 1765. I know that. Don't worry about New York City. And know that 9 counties sent delegates there to air their grievances. Again, the Stamp Act Congress did not immediately change things. It did not immediately end the Stamp Act, but it was one of the first steps to unifying the counties. I think this is important. We saw that more counties were there, and they're starting to see themselves as Americans, and they're starting to get annoyed with the British. All right, so what really helps end the Stamp Act? It is non-importation agreements, the boycotts. Okay, this basically becomes very popular throughout the counties, and it helps force the British to end the Stamp Act. And the violence probably did work as well, and violence did break out, and it terrorized the Stamp Act agents as well. And it showed that the colonists would get violent to try to stand up for what they believe in. And the great news for the colonists, the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, so it was a great victory against British oppression. I mentioned in the previous slide the Declaratory Act was passed by British, saying that they could pass any laws on the colonists. Again, it's a way to try to save face. All right, our final slide is this. All right, here's our final slide, and this is a visual. We love documents. And on the top, just notice it says the repeal. Okay, so this is the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. And so again, give you a second to look at this primary source document. Look at the people, look at their faces. So up here's where we see some ships in the background. They're British ships. This is probably Boston Harbor. And these look like British officials, and looks like they are on their way back to Britain. And they probably could be Stamp Act agents, and so it shows that they lost. Okay, and then notice a couple other things. Here's my favorite thing: is Maggie down here. Maggie, Maggie? Come on, don't pee on that guy. All right, fire up.